For a long time now, green beauty has relied on a very simple idea, which is this. If an ingredient comes from a plant, it must be better. I'm talking about better for the skin, better for the environment, better full stop. And I understand why that belief exists. It's because plants feel familiar and safe, and they feel connected to land and tradition and something older than us, something ancestral. A cold-pressed oil from a seed or a nut feels reassuring in a way that an ingredient made in a lab simply does not. But that idea starts to wobble the moment we zoom out. Because when we talk about plants in cosmetics, we're no longer talking about a garden or a field or a forest or a small producer harvesting carefully. We're talking about global supply chains and monocultures and land conversion and tens of millions of tons of oil. Palm oil is the clearest example of this. Around 70% of all cosmetics contain at least one palm-derived ingredient. And at that scale, the word plant-based then stops being gentle and starts being industrial. And that is an uncomfortable tension that I want to sit with today in this podcast episode. So stay tuned as I'm going to unpick what this means. Hi, it's Lorraine Dallmeier, chartered environmentalist, biologist, and CEO of the award-winning online organic cosmetic formulation school, Formula Botanica. I host the Green Beauty Conversations podcast, and these are my green beauty opinions, where I challenge you to think differently about how the beauty industry works and where it's heading. If you enjoy these episodes, make sure you subscribe so you never miss one. So last week here on the podcast, I spoke to Namaila Bonturi, the co-founder and CEO of IO, which is a small biotech startup based in Estonia. And Namaila told the story of how she turned her second longest relationship with a very specific yeast into a company that makes functional oils for cosmetics using fermentation. And one of those oils is really cool. It's vivid, almost shocking red, and it's made from sugar and yeast, not from a tree. From a seed, not from land that needs to be cleared or planted. And I've been thinking about that conversation ever since, not because fermentation oils are new, because of what they force us to confront. And many people in green beauty feel instinctively that an oil from a plant is superior to an oil from a yeast. I hear this reaction a lot, and you know what? I don't dismiss it. Because biotechnology can feel futuristic and it can feel a little bit synthetic because of the lab component. To some people, it feels like something they don't want to trust. So I think it's worth asking whether that discomfort is actually about chemistry or whether it's about storytelling. Because yeast is alive and fermentation is ancient. And microbes have been making fats and oils and pigments on this planet long before we ever pressed our first seed. And in fact, when I look back in the history books, I think it's worth noting that humans have actually been using fermentation for at least, we think, 10,000 years, possibly even longer. And the earliest archaeological evidence comes from Neolithic China, where residues of fermented rice and honey and fruit drinks date back to around about 7,000 years before the current era. And not long after that, we then see clear evidence of fermented beer in Mesopotamia and fermented wine in the Caucasus and fermented dairy in regions where people were domesticating animals. So it's important to note that fermentation wasn't a technology in the modern sense. It's something that people discovered by observing nature and learning how to work with microbes, long before we understood what yeast or bacteria actually even were. So bread, beer, wine, yogurt, kefir, cheese, soy sauce, vinegar, sauerkraut. These are all products of fermentation that have been part of human diets and cultures for thousands of years. So when we talk about fermentation today in a biotech context, we're not talking about something new or synthetic. In fact, actually, we're just talking about a very old human practice, which is now carried out with far more precision and control. And the microbes are doing exactly what they've always done. The difference is that we now understand the process, and we can choose to use it intentionally rather than accidentally. So in my view, the real issue here is that we've been using the term plant-based as a proxy for sustainability without asking whether that still holds true at a global scale. So a small, local, thoughtfully sourced plant oil can absolutely be a beautiful choice. But when the entire cosmetics industry depends on a handful of crops grown in specific parts of the world, we're no longer really talking about harmony with nature then, are we? We're talking about pressure on land, on biodiversity, on communities, and on supply chains that are already showing signs of strain. And what struck me about Dallmeier's work at IO is that it doesn't come from a place of trying to outperform nature or replace it because it's flawed. Instead, it comes from an acknowledgement that we've asked too much of land-based systems for too long. Fermentation isn't a magic fix and it isn't impact-free, but it does change the equation and it decouples oils from land use and it allows production to happen closer to where the ingredients are needed. And it forces us to rethink what we actually mean when we say that an ingredient is natural. And this isn't the first time that the beauty industry has faced this tension, of course. We already accept fermented hyaluronic acid and fermented ceramides and fermented vitamins and fermented preservatives without much debate. And oils feel different because they are emotionally loaded, I guess. They're tied to imagery of plants and fields and cold-pressed purity. But feeling comfortable with an ingredient is not the same as it being sustainable. And sustainability has never been about what looks nicest on the label. It's about systems and scale. And it's about asking what happens if everyone does the same thing. So I don't believe this is a story of plants versus biotech or of artisans versus labs. I also don't think or believe that fermentation means the end of botanical ingredients. What I do believe is that green beauty needs to let go of purity narratives, and I think it needs to start engaging more honestly with trade-offs. So in a climate-constrained world, which is what we have and what we're facing, we may not always have the luxury of choosing ingredients based on nostalgia or choosing what feels most natural to us emotionally. We'll have to look harder at things like impact and resilience and long-term viability, and possibly fermentation may play a big role in that. So my challenge to you this week is this. The next time you instinctively feel that a plant-based ingredient must be better than an ingredient made with microbes, I want you to pause and ask yourself why. Ask whether that belief still holds when you factor in land use and scale and global demand. And ask whether sustainability, at the level that the beauty industry now operates, might require solutions that feel possibly unfamiliar or even uncomfortable at first. Because green beauty doesn't move forward by clinging to what feels safe. It moves forward by being willing to question its own assumptions. And if we want an industry that can exist in the long term, we need to get much better at doing exactly that. Thank you for listening to my Green Beauty Opinions. Remember to visit the Formula Botanica website at formulabotanica.com to try our free online formulation course. And if you haven't subscribed to the Green Beauty Conversations podcast yet, please do so now in your favorite podcast app. Leave me a review if you find these chats and discussions useful, and I'll be back soon with my next episode.